South India in the 1940s was experiencing a subtle, quiet crisis. Inside the established churches, congregations sat through formal services that felt entirely hollow. The rituals were precise, but the spiritual life within them seemed to have dried up. Believers who were hungry for a clear, Bible-based message found themselves wandering from denomination to denomination. Instead of receiving spiritual nourishment, they were met with stereotyped sermons that lacked any real direction. A heavy burden fell on the shoulders of a few ordinary laymen. Men like R. Rajamani recognized this deep dissatisfaction. They were not ordained ministers. They were regular professionals with highly demanding secular careers, yet they felt compelled to step into the gap. This photograph shows the central offices of the Madras and South Maratha Railway. Rajamani held a prestigious rank in the audit department here. His days were consumed by high-level administrative work, yet his evenings were driven by spiritual hunger. When the established clergy fails to provide direction, the responsibility shifts to those willing to give up their own rest. These men had to sacrifice their personal time, evenings and weekends, to build their desperate community. Rajamani and his peers began pooling whatever free time they had. They used their accumulated long leave from their secular jobs to throw themselves into gospel campaigns, hosting meetings in their homes and wherever they found space. You can see the psychological toll this took in Rajamani's own writings. Here in his memoir, he describes the exact feeling. The congregations were like sheep without a shepherd. They were trying to support a broken system, and the effort was draining their spiritual life. Despite their exhaustion, the response to their meetings was overwhelming. The numbers grew rapidly each week, that they had to build a temporary physical structure. With the help of local converts, they erected a large shed in a borrowed compound just to give the people a place to gather. Even that was insufficient. The crowds quickly outgrew the shed, spilling out of the borrowed compounds. They had sparked a massive movement, and now they faced an immediate crisis. They had absolutely nowhere to put these people. By 1941, the movement had outgrown its temporary boundaries. The surge of new believers had effectively made a permanent sanctuary a requirement for the mission to continue. According to this page from the historical record, the evangelist Bakht Singh shared a specific vision. While at prayer, he foresaw a house and grounds spacious enough for their massive task. That single vision mobilized the entire congregation to comb the city of Madras. They quickly found the ideal property, a large, spacious compound. But there was an immediate barrier. The owner was a Muslim landlord who was highly reluctant to lease to a Christian group. When they arrived with rent, he kept them waiting and initially ignored their presence. Rajamani decided to try a highly unconventional approach. As recorded here, he showed the landlord a verse from 1 Chronicles. "The palace is for the Lord God." The landlord's shift was total. He declared himself a man who feared God, handed over the keys, and paid for all repairs, even building a baptistry. This single interaction removed the largest barrier to the mission. By the time the repairs were finished, the most unlikely gatekeeper in Madras had become the congregation's most essential benefactor. On July 12, 1941, the congregation officially moved in. They named the property Jehovah Shammah. Translated, it means the Lord is there, and they intended it to be a sanctuary open at any hour of the day or night. The community immediately implemented radical social practices. As detailed in this account, they required all new converts to take the public step of sitting down together to eat a communal meal. This process was designed to actively dismantle deep-rooted caste and social hierarchies. As this radically unified family grew, the sheer administrative and pastoral weight became immense. They needed dedicated leadership, men who could guide the expanding congregation through intense, unified prayer rather than top-down executive orders. The selection process required a full week of fasting and prayer. As described here, the congregation was asked if anyone had the least objection to the candidates. Only when absolute unity was reached did they proceed with the laying on of hands to consecrate their new leaders. This photograph gives us a look at the early leadership. The man on the left is R. Rajamani. He, along with R. P. Dorairaj and George T. Rajaratnam, were the 3 laymen officially set apart to shepherd the flock they had gathered. The legacy of Jehovah Shammah was found in the dismantling of caste hierarchies at the dinner table, where railway officials and recent converts ate side by side. Just 6 years after moving in, an external crisis emerged. The 1947 Indian independence and partition displaced millions of people across the subcontinent, and the chaos directly jeopardized the church's new home. The crisis was entirely bureaucratic. As this document shows, their Muslim landlord opted to relocate to Pakistan. Because of the partition laws, the site immediately reverted to the central government of India, forcing the church into years of precarious tenancy. For 3 years, they paid rent directly to the government collector, uncertain of their future. Finally, in 1950, the property was put up for public auction. The congregation pooled their resources and purchased the land outright, securing their home permanently. With the property secured, Rajamani made a final personal sacrifice. As recorded here, he retired from his railway job in 1951. While most men sought re-employment, he told his boss he was dedicating the rest of his life entirely to the service of the church. By 1950, the property had transitioned from a government-controlled asset back into the hands of the people who had built it. The security of their home no longer depended on political border shifts, but on the communal funds raised to buy it at auction. With the legal title secured, the elders turned their attention back to the congregation. They saw that a permanent address meant little if the spiritual intensity of the early nomadic years began to fade among the members. To guarantee the future, they executed a strategic pivot. They redirected their intense early morning prayer sessions away from their own immediate adult problems and focused entirely on the children, praying for the Sunday school students individually by name. That focus bore visible fruit. Lively outdoor baptisms began taking place in the stone pool beneath the shade of the large rain trees. They were watching a new generation awaken to the faith. A quarter of a century after its founding, the landscape of the church began to shift. As Rajamani notes in this passage, the original pioneers who had fought for the building and broken the caste barriers were passing away. The survival of this community now rests on whether the next generation adopts the same standard of radical equality and sacrifice that Rajamani and his peers established in the 1940s. In the spring of 1908, the village of Surindai was a quiet cluster of white houses nestled among the green rice fields of southern India. But one 12-year-old boy was determined to disrupt that peace. His name was R.R. Rajamani. By his own admission, he was an inveterate troublemaker. Acting as their gang leader, he would deliberately pick fights, steal other students' books, and find every possible way to make life miserable for the weaker students. This behavior stood in sharp contrast to his environment. Surindai was a traditional, orderly place, deeply rooted in its customs and the quiet rhythms of agricultural life. Rajamani's own aggression was a glaring anomaly. The turning point arrived on a dusty football field. After a game, as the other boys ran back to their hostel laughing, an English teacher named Mr. Archibald held Rajamani back. He didn't yell or dole out punishment. He just placed a hand on his shoulder and asked a single, piercing question. "Why are you so bad, Rajamani?" For Rajamani, that question acted as a point of internal collapse. He later realized that the transformation of his community began not with a strategic plan, but with the quiet breaking of his own stubbornness. Fast forward to the 1930s, and the environment around Rajamani looked vastly different. South India was rapidly modernizing. Cities were expanding, and the region was entering a period of massive cultural and political upheaval. At the same time, traditional religious institutions were struggling to adapt. The colonial-era church structures were heavily funded from overseas and deeply institutionalized. But as the desire for Indian independence grew, these foreign-backed structures faced intense cultural pushback. This created a severe vacuum. There was a rising demand for an indigenous, grassroots expression of faith, one entirely free from foreign money, formal constitutions, and bureaucratic control. The spiritual awakening that soon took hold in South India found its traction exactly here. It was driven by local individuals stepping directly into that void, with the former street tough Rajamani leading the effort. By 1935, Rajamani was a changed man. He and a small group of friends in Madras banded together to form the Gospel League. This chart illustrates how radical their approach was for the time. On the left, the traditional colonial model. Foreign funding dictates a formal institution, which trickles down to the people. The League rejected this entirely, operating with zero reliance on foreign mission funds. Instead, they built a flat, decentralized network driven purely by volunteer energy. They printed their own tracts, built temporary bamboo shelters for meetings, and marched directly into the city streets, pounding tambourines and speaking to anyone who would listen. Their efforts caught the attention of an itinerant evangelist named Bakht Singh. When he visited Madras, he challenged the young men to abandon conventional strategy and depend on prayer. He gathered them on the hard bamboo mats of a local hall and initiated an all-night vigil. Rajamani knelt perfectly erect, closed his eyes, and poured out his heart. When he finally opened his eyes, stunned that daylight had already broken, he noted he had been caught in an absolute rapture of prayer. This wasn't a one-time event. That grueling, unyielding level of commitment became their standard operating procedure. They fasted regularly, met in the early morning hours, and spent weekends conducting preaching raids. This total reliance on prayer functioned as their primary infrastructure. Without external funding or central management, the group's continued operation depended entirely on the internal conviction of its individual members. But that conviction was soon tested. Bakht Singh eventually departed to continue his travels, leaving the fledgling group without their primary mentor. Rajamani described this period as feeling like they had been left alone on the road to Jericho, vulnerable and abandoned to fend for themselves. Compounding this leadership vacuum was a global crisis. World War II reached India, bringing severe economic hardship. Supplies were heavily rationed, and everyday life became an exercise in managing extreme scarcity. Many groups would have folded under the dual weight of isolation and war. Instead, Rajamani and his peers doubled down. In July 1941, they secured a rental property at 19 Ritherdon Road in Madras and established their own sanctuary, naming it Jehovah Shammah. The intensity of their work only escalated. Teachers woke at 4 a.m. to pray for unruly children individually by name. Large bands of volunteers launched raids into surrounding villages, sleeping on floors and enduring massive rail transport delays caused by the military. Scarcity and perceived abandonment did not destroy their movement. The wilderness was the exact environment required to strip away their remaining dependencies and forge an unbreakable resilience. That resilience met its ultimate challenge in August 1947. India achieved its long-awaited independence, but it came with the chaotic, violent, and deeply painful partition of the country. The geopolitical earthquake directly hit their local congregation. The owner of the property they had rented for Jehovah Shammah was Muslim, and like millions of others, he opted to leave his home and flee to the newly formed state of Pakistan. Because he relocated, he was legally disqualified from holding property in India. The land and the building instantly reverted to the central government, which eventually placed the site up for public auction. The property went on the block for 1,64,000 rupees. In 1950, that was a staggering sum of money, an impossible figure for a grassroots community surviving entirely on voluntary donations. They were staring down an existential threat. If the strength of their movement was tied to the physical real estate of 19 Ritherdon Road, they were finished. But if it was truly rooted in the people, they could survive the loss of any building. Rajamani and his peers recognized that the structure was just an empty shell. The real work had happened in the streets, in the grueling all-night vigils, and in the transformed lives of the men and women who had gathered there. They operated under a philosophy Rajamani compared to the cave of Adullam. They believed that capable leaders are trained in the obscurity of caves, through self-discipline and in the daily friction of relentless hardship. By the 1960s, hundreds of these independent assemblies had appeared across India and into Southeast Asia. Their survival through the partition proved that the movement's strength resided in the local community's ability to function without a physical home or central treasury.